Before we proceed, just a quick reminder that you can use the chat and the Q&A modules that are integrated in Whova to share and communicate your questions and thoughts throughout the whole duration of the session. And without further ado, I would like to welcome and pass the microphone to the President of the International Society of the Learning Sciences, Victor Lee. Victor, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Irene. Thank you all for coming, especially those of you for whom this is a unusual hour to be attending a talk. In 2020, the world more fully acknowledged a long-standing problem, which was anti-Black bias and racism. While there are events in the United States that prompted protests and more visible activism, this is a worldwide issue, and it is one example of how both overt and less recognized forms of biases, marginalization, discrimination, and racism create inequitable situations for people around the world. In this presidential plenary session, we'll have the opportunity to celebrate that despite facing systemic obstacles, valued members of our community are helping to advance our collective goal of using scholarship on learning to improve circumstances and opportunities for all. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Krista Astrahan, Associate Professor at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, who will provide a brief bio and introduction for our first speaker.
Hi, everyone. I promise not to share any embarrassing details about our late night hotel room sessions that we have every year at ICLS. I will keep it very, very strict to the point. Dr. Cherise Clarke, or as she has once been coined famously by Christine Lund, Dr. Clarice Shark, which is actually a nice alter ego, I think, Mrs. Shark, Miss Shark, Dr. Shark. She studies the interface between social inequality, discourse, and learning in her research. Or as she, like in every conversation that she and I have, she has a way of putting everything into words more succinctly and more precisely. So in her own words, she examines the ways in which access to content, instruction, and learning opportunities is structured at the micro level, that is in interactions and in dialogue. And she seeks both to understand those processes and also to design ways to disrupt the reproduction of these social inequalities. Among others, she has done this in the UK in the context of immigrant refugees and asylum seekers. And in the US, among others, her work has focused on middle school students in science classes and in science discussions, and also on teacher pedagogical reasoning about their practice. A native of New York, her BA is from the City University of New York. She has lived in Thailand for a few years. This is the only embarrassing, well, not embarrassing, because it's such a great detail about her life that maybe not all of you know. She is fluent in Thai. She has lived in Thailand for a few years. She's fluent in Thai. Her MA and her PhD are from the University of Edinburgh. And she has been a postdoctoral research and a postdoctoral fellow at LRDC at the University of Pittsburgh. And currently, since 2014, she's assistant professor at San Diego University. Together with Amy Ogan, she directs one of the prestigious McDonald Foundation-funded centers on teacher learning. Their center is called Class Insights, Insights on Teacher Learning by Scaffolding, Noticing, and Reflection. It is my honor to present Cherise.
Thank you, Krista. Oh, wait, hold on. I'm unmuted now. Okay, so let me just share my screen. Bear with me a moment. Okay, so I'm really delighted to talk to you all this morning. It's 5 in the morning in San Diego. And yeah, I'm really delighted to share what I've been thinking about. So I studied classroom dialogue, and I hang out in the minutia of classroom discourse data to examine the ways in which teachers engage students in a shared reasoning process that support conceptual transformation in subjects like science. And the externalization of thinking and discussion does something beautiful. It instigates disequilibrium. It forces one to reckon with and begin to reconcile half-baked thinking into conceptually coherent thinking. And as an interlocutor, different perspectives provide ways of walking around an ideational space. And so many studies that center social processes such as achievement gaps as existential facts for Black, Indigenous, and children of color. However, I see these classifications as a consequence of many micro moments to learn, or ones that have been unjustly denied. And we may debate whether or not these moments are intentional or not, but the consequences of these moments in aggregate are real, felt, and create futures. So today I want to share with you a slice of the work that I'm doing to begin to think about what the substrates are for Black excellence, to design for Black futures, because the stakes are high for Black kids, like people like me. So I wanna, before we dig in, I wanna situate this talk in a conversation I had with my postdoc and dear colleague, Eunseong Lee, the other day about Black excellence, the celebration of which is the theme of this session. And Eunseong asked, what I was gonna say about Black excellence. And I said quickly, well, that it's a fact, it's a known. It doesn't need to be proved. You don't have to look hard for evidence such as the talents of Serena Williams or the brilliant and ever relevant Black existential analysis of James Baldwin for proofs. I'm talking about average Black people. The fact that Black people exist in present day America, that we love, we create, we have joy, is proof of concept. We grow in barren regions where no waters flow. We dare to thrive in a system that is designed to maintain our oppression. We are magical peoples. And I'm not just saying that because I'm Black. I get goosebumps when I'm imagining what it might have felt like for my great-grandfather Moses Wood to march to war with this banner as its symbol, to fight for his freedom as an enslaved man in the American South. I am ever reverent. But while I believe that Black people's resilience and brilliance against all odds is a fact, if we focus only on Black exceptionalism with respect to the education of Black children, then we make the status quo of educational injustice a perennial blind spot. And suddenly we've lost sight of the charge of educational design to foster human development. In my group, in our work with teachers of students of color, we have been thinking a lot about teacher schemas and logics, or what Goffman calls frameworks. Frames are ways of organizing experiences, and our frames guide the ways in which we encode things. Distorted frames about Black men encode and conflate their corporality with criminality. If folks are to begin to value Black life, then there's an urgent need to engage in a serious and sustained process of reframing around Black minds and Black bodies as a necessary cultural and social transformation in the US and around the world. I mean, as a brief analog, I want you to just think about what I mean with respect to the post-Me Too era, which has helped to reframe the ways in which many people think about women's bodies, reinscribing practices that were normative into new codes that help to delineate the ubiquitous harm in gendered relations of power. And I draw my optimism from social transformations such as this. So I think we can do this. So the optimism that people can change, that changed people can change society, and that a changed society can cultivate new cultural practices and processes is the optimism that is baked right into the fabric of our discipline. And I want to be clear that the work of educational equity and anti-racism requires collective social transformation in order to reframe the ubiquitous distortions about Black minds and Black bodies. So what I and my group have been thinking about is how micro moments of class discussion can be a design space for educational equity. So I want to shift into thinking about the stakes of micro moments for Black futures through a project that I've been working on. So my thought tools forced me to toggle between the minutiae of micro practices and the social processes and structures they constitute at the macro level. I take the view that that individual and collective agency can begin to chip away at structures and systems that organize society. Drawing on the work of Carla O'Connor, I take the view that racial identities and realities are embodied in interactions. My unit of analysis is talk, and through talk, I examine how learning is constituted in discursive interaction. Particularly, I consider the cognitive and socio-cognitive implicature of talk, the ways in which questions that are posed to kids intellectually position them in certain ways in the learning space. Drawing on the work of Bourdieu, I think about how relations of power inscribe and sanction certain forms of talk and certain speakers as valid. But finally, again, optimistically, the reproductive momentum of micro moments can disrupt the status quo, is the view that I take. So what's at stake? So Biesta argues that agency should be understood as a configuration of the past, orientations towards the future, and engagement with the present. And I think we need this kind of temporal lens to fully engage with what is at stake in micro moments of classroom interaction and how they collect and shape educational futures. I want to situate the data part of this talk in an introduction to my first friend in Kinder, Janelle Johnson. So Janelle Johnson is a geneticist for the NIH. And I introduced Janelle not to highlight her Black exceptionalism, but as an anchor for your mind's eye, a concrete Black future as we look at some data of micro moments of a discussion of a high school science lesson on genetic inheritance. So the study that I'm going to talk about is Talkways, what we were doing, the premises are that, you know, it's less likely to find academically rigorous dialogue in classrooms that serve low income and children of color and from linguistically diverse backgrounds. And so our goal was to try and unpack this a bit more by tracing habitus, the schemas and heuristics that are used to interpret students' ideation in science discussions. We had a couple of design principles for this study. One, we wanted to preserve the rich complexity of audio recorded class discussions. We wanted to bound them within a single topical focus so we can see how teachers operate on a particular ideational focus. And we wanted to focus in on segments that that merited some instructional decision by teachers, so we can see how they're using these moments to think and move pedagogically. And in addition, we wanted to design so that there were some focal kids, so we can see the way teachers were thinking particularly about particular kids. We designed this instrument. It was an open-ended online audio video based survey. And it contains 7 discussion segments from data that I gathered when I was at the University of Pittsburgh in classrooms. Yeah, I guess I can't say where they're classrooms, but in public schools in Pennsylvania. We had a couple of focal youth, Shamika, Amir, Silas, Don, Phil. And the focal topic was Punnett squares, and the lesson goals we imposed on this scenario frame were scaffolding students' probabilistic reasoning with Punnett squares. We administered a survey online, and we had 21 complete respondents, because it was a very long instrument. On average, it took an hour and a half to complete. And the respondents were from schools around DC, LA, New York, Chicago, and Colorado Springs. So when the data came in, it was clear. There was a pattern way that teacher respondents were interpreting the focal child we called Shamika. Her racial identity only signified by her name and her African-American English vernacular. That's it. We gave no background about the children. We didn't say, anything about what any individual child, anything about their background, just the topic of the lesson, and presented them with these discussion scenarios. And so we use Shamika as a critical case of discussion to trace the heuristics employed to interpret a Black girl's questions and discussions about genetic inheritance. So I won't read the transcript in detail, but I'll just give you the overall scenario. So Mr. Nelson's class is exploring how the first generation of dark cats, dark orange parent cats and a light orange parent cat had a second generation of 8 orange, dark orange kittens. And Kristen in a discussion is advancing a hypothesis that the cross between 2 homozygous parent cats would explain the offspring being heterozygous. And Shamika says, oh, she's just trying to sound smart, referring to Kristen's use of the technical language. And Mr. Nelson invites the class to participate. This is the teacher. And concludes that there's a need to clarify the terms homozygous and heterozygous. And a kid named Philippe starts to define one of the words, and Shamika intervenes with a question and then starts formulating it, saying, if no alleles, wait, hold on. So you said alleles are not the same, right? And this appears to be an effort by Shamika to formulate a question about sameness in genetic material, while Denisha and Kenyatta are answering Mr. Nelson's question about terminology. The segment ends with Mr. Nelson stating, I need to clarify and move on. This is all the segment is. It's a tiny little segment. For analysis, the instrument produced really rich teacher explanations, reasoning, and decision-making. And we set out to examine through discourse analysis how text points to context. So the ways in which teachers inscribed meaning from the segments and as a micro analytic way to look at the heuristics employed hearing and thinking about how to act on discussion as a teacher. So we looked at several things. First, attributions about Shamika, focusing on spontaneous labels used to characterize her intellectual capacity, frames that seem to undergird those interpretations. And we then looked at the decision-making on how to act in the discussion in terms of instructional decisions, focusing on how they situated Shamika's ideation as worthy of pursuit in discussion. And so here's what we found. And I'll focus on the predominant interpretive logic about Shamika in this next slide. So simply put, when we look at the relationships between labels, such as below basic, frames and decisions, we found that the labels about Shamika were predominantly negative, like she's below basic, Shamika doesn't know what she doesn't know. The frames about her were predominantly deficit oriented, and her ideation was interpreted as not worthy of taking up to further on discussion. And so I want to remind us briefly again that in the discussion segment, Shamika was using her agency to try and see if she was getting the science right. But her questions are being coded primarily with deficit frames. And her development is not taking on as something, at least within the respondents of this study, as something worth pursuing. So I'm just going to wrap up by saying, I hope that through this talk I've made, or started to make a case about the following: that small things grow into big things, or small acts can accumulate and settle into practices and habits of mind. And practices and habits of mind can congeal to form cultures, and cultures shape society. Like many of us in the learning sciences, I've become preoccupied in my research and just in my general movement around the world with prefiguration. Put simply, it's the relationship between the ends and means that calls attention to the means by which we work towards ends. And I asked the question of what interpretations about Shamika's capacity might be like if we centered her possible future. As a geneticist, for example, like Janelle, what might her questions signify if we took that future on as a frame for the present? And how can we take up her questions to support her development for her possible futures? So I'll just end there, and I want to give a bit of gratitude to the many amazing Black women who have made my future possible, and give a shout out to my wonderful thought partners in my lab. So thank you.
It's my pleasure now to introduce Dr. Chandan Dasgupta. He is an assistant professor at Indian Institute of Technology in Bombay, and he will provide an introduction for our next speaker. Chandan?
Thanks, Victor, and thanks, Cherise, for the wonderful talk. I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Christopher Wright. He is an assistant professor of STEM education in the Drexel University School of Education and co-director of the Informal Learning Linking Science, Engineering, and Technology Lab. Despite earning a Bachelor of Architecture from Hampton University, he found his passion as an engineering teacher at his high school alma mater in Baltimore, Maryland, and continued on to earn a PhD in STEM education from Tufts University. His research calls upon critical perspectives while engaging in the design of pre-K-12 engineering learning environments. Informed by his previous teaching experiences, Christopher's work explores opportunities for centering the lives and voices of minoritized young people in an effort to collaboratively reimagine STEM learning spaces that affirm, cultivate, and build upon young people's intellectual and linguistic resources. Dr. Wright is a previous recipient of a National Science Foundation Early Career Award and a 2019 Presidential Early Career Award for Scientists and Engineers. The Presidential Early Career Award is the highest honor bestowed by the government of the United States to researchers for the outstanding contribution to the field and also for the future potential. Till now, very few education researchers have received this award. So it's a pleasure to have you here, Dr. Christopher Wright. Welcome, the floor is all yours.
Thank you for that introduction. I really appreciate that. Give me 1 second, I will share my screen. Yeah, so again, thank you for that introduction, and it's truly an honor to be able to contribute to this presidential session today that's focused on the idea of Black excellence within the learning sciences. Additionally, I would like to also thank Dr. Victor Lee for the opportunity to speak today, and also to my co-presenter, Dr. Cherise Clark, for a number of inspiring conversations as we prepared to highlight this idea of Black excellence. I will admit that when first presented with this idea, I was a bit challenged just to think about, just how to put into words what I think about the notions of like Black excellence, because it's just such a vast thing and something that's so personal to me. So on the day that Dr. Lee did present me with the opportunity or the chance to speak with you all, I did find it rather ironic that I just so happened to be wearing one of my favorite t-shirts in my collection, right? And so the t-shirt is special because it was a graduation gift from my mother after earning my PhD. And the t-shirt read, or reads, "I am my ancestors' wildest dreams," right? And so this shirt is a constant reminder that I sit on the shoulders of those before me, and that I am here today, in large part due to the determinations, persistence, and imaginations of my ancestors that dared to dream of future possibilities, or what I refer to as imagining the what's not imagined at that point. So as I come before you today to think about ways in which we conceptualize Black excellence in the learning sciences, I actually want to talk a bit about what we as a community of scholars can learn from by recognizing one's ability to imagine possible futures as a single exemplar of what it means or how to think about Black excellence and the potential for situating the notion of dreaming when we consider varied conceptions of learning, okay? So in my work, we center the notion of dreaming or production of new imaginings as we approach the design of STEM learning contexts within a place that we refer to as dream spaces, or spaces where Black children engage in the reimagining of what counts as science, engineering, and making. And they're often afforded opportunities to try out and imagine new identities within the disciplines. I believe that far too often, spaces for STEM learning act as spaces where dreams actually go to perish for Black children, right? As we present narrow conceptions of what counts as science, engineering, and making, and also who qualifies as legitimate doers of STEM in this regard. So I would like to start this conversation about, our notion of dream spaces by sharing a quick story. So I was once working in a 4th grade classroom at Benjamin Banneker Elementary School, where the vast majority of the students are Black and brown. The teacher wanted to introduce her students to the joys and wonders of engineering design, and spent about 3 to 4 weeks developing a unit where students would take on the role of mechanical engineers as they designed and constructed model windmills, okay? So the initial belief was that providing students with the mere existence of engaging in hands-on manipulation of materials would capture students' imaginations and thinking about science and engineering. So during the next couple of weeks, students designed and redesigned windmill blades, hoping to capture the most wind. They judged their designs based on their use of limited resources. And they made presentations where they described and defined, and defended their design decisions. So on the last day of the unit, the teacher is feeling fantastic about seeing the students' perceived excitement and engagement with this windmill project. as the class is cleaning up, I'm stopped by a young man by the name of Raekwon, an extremely smart African-American boy with a playful and sarcastic personality. So Raekwon says, "Hey, Dr. Wright, man, that was a really dope project, and I had fun learning about windmills and blade designs. But I got a question. What the hell do windmills have to do with me?" So in that moment, I had a number of ways in which I could have interpreted Raekwon's question. I could have complained that we just spent 3 to 4 weeks designing a unit that this child did not appreciate. I could have thought that Raekwon just didn't get it because these are the kinds of projects and practices that real engineering students engage in. Or I could have focused on the audacity of this little kid asking me what in the hell. Each of these reactions could have been considered common responses. However, I took up a different approach. I used this instance, as well as others that will be later discussed, as an opportunity to challenge us to think about the science, engineering, and making content and practices that we present to young people. I used this opportunity to ask my team to reimagine how we present to young people what counts as engineering and what scientists and engineers could actually look like. So instead of pulling a Drake and getting all caught up in my feelings about my own work, I was challenged to think about approaches for designing spaces where young people could collectively dream and reimagine what science and engineering could be for them. So hence, as I currently serve young people in the Philadelphia area where I am in the United States, we were playing around with this notion of nurturing our young people's dream chasing mentality, right? That's inspired by a Philly born and bred artist by the name of Meek Mill. So considering, reflecting upon and analyzing lyrics such as, "I used to pray for times like this, to rhyme like this, so I had to grind like this, to shine like this," has motivated us to consider and explore how we conceptualize learning spaces that build upon the dreams, the drive, the perseverance, and the grind that Meek describes here in this actual song title. So going back to the text on my T-shirt, I also want to connect and ground this contemporary idea of dream chasing with the histories that have also grounded Black communities throughout time. So despite living in an era where the humanity and dignity of Black folks were in question, Harriet Tubman once stated, "Dream big, for every great dream begins with a dreamer. Always remember that you have within you the strength, the patience, and passion to reach for the stars and change the world." So I also call upon the iconic words of the civil rights leader, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., as he once stated, "I say to you today, my friends, that in spite of the difficulties and frustrations of the moment, I still have a dream." So my point in all of this is to highlight that dreams and the act of dream chasing have consistently served as instances of Black excellence throughout history, right? So daring to dream has served as acts of resistance in moments of experiencing racialized terror, acts of inspiration, even during moments of community setbacks, and acts of aspiration when imagining a day in which we shall overcome. So in my work, we too acknowledge and privilege the role that, that daring to dream or dream chasing could have. As we design and conceptualize STEM learning spaces, consider what it means to support Black children as they pursue and refine their own STEM dreams, and what it means to cultivate spaces where Black children are encouraged to imagine the unimaginable in STEM. So getting back to Raekwon, Raekwon and young people like him have inspired the creation of the informal learning linking engineering, science, and engineering lab on the campus of Drexel University. Right? Also referred to as the ILLIST, we envisioned the lab as a dream space where Black children could come to and dare to dream about future possibilities in science, engineering, and making. So typically when we consider ways of connecting Black students to science, engineering, and making, we often situate the issue within this need to fix children or to teach grit, persistence, or resilience. In a dream space approach, historical and contemporary exemplars of dream chasing and imagining future possibilities illustrate the already existence of grit, persistence, and resilience within these communities. Thus, the challenge becomes to explore and imagine what it means to fix the learning environment for which young people engage in. So this step in the process of cultivating our dream spaces is what I consider to be one of the most important elements in this process. The part where we engage in the practice of self-reflection and challenging our own assumptions, our own beliefs, our own understandings, and what some within our learning scientist community describe as our own set of expectations of who and what counts in science, engineering, and making. So the challenge becomes that we cannot promote spaces of imagination, innovation, creativity, and learning if we are ourselves unwilling to push ourselves to unimagined places and recognize our own limitations. So at the ILLIST, we live by the notion that the space is student-centered, where we build relationships with students, acknowledge their life experiences, attend to their histories, and also cultivate their identities as doers of science and engineering and makers. So additionally, while this session is themed as Black excellence in the learning sciences, at the ILLIST, we also believe that it's important to recognize and acknowledge Black excellence where it already exists, right? So thus, we attempt to prioritize the celebration of science, engineering, and making in places and inquiries where it already exists for young people as we further develop dream spaces. An essential element in supporting dream chasing or conceiving of new imaginings in a dream space is that we as teachers and researchers assume that Black excellence resides in all of our young people and look to build upon the science, the engineering, and the making that already exists within these communities. So some of our recent inquiries or some of our recent projects have pushed the boundaries of what counts as STEM and who engages in STEM practices. So we have situated sneakers and a sneakerhead culture as a legitimate STEM and design inquiry, while also exploring how practices of computational making exist within hip hop culture through instances of DJing, B-girling, and B-boying. So in addition to this quick overview of the two instances of dreamscaping, I want to spend my remaining couple of minutes here unpacking one specific project that called upon new imaginings and possibilities within science and engineering. So I initiate this discussion of unimagined possibilities in science and engineering by asking you to take a minute to examine the images on the slide. When you look at the slide, what are some of the things that you observe or things that stand out? What are potential science inquiries that you could envision just from this initial observation? So I'm going to give you a couple of seconds to dig a tad bit deeper into these images. So while there are a number of observations to be made, I want to highlight a particular observation and connection that was made by a really, really fantastic scholar by the name of Dr. Rashida Likely. So although each of these women, being of African descent, they also have very different hair textures. Images like these pictured here and knowledge of the similarities and differences within Black hair care inspired Dr. Likely to imagine a dream space for science exploration that's centered around variations in Black hair care texture, as well as processes in Black and skin care. Collaborating with a group of middle school girls, Dr. Likely called upon the historical, the social, and political implications that hair has played in the lives of Black women and girls. This dream space of centering Black hair as a scientific inquiry emerged from an understanding that while hair serves as a complex topic in biology, it is also an important representation of identity and culture for many people, regardless of race or gender identification. However, hair for Black women and girls has historically been politicized as a way to communicate messages of age, marital status, gender expression, social status, and self-worth and interest, right? A Black woman's choice of hairstyle could lead to acceptance or rejection from certain groups or social classes, and a styling could provide or constrain the possibility of a career. Thus, this example of a dream space found ways of connecting a scientific inquiry with the deep history and social roots within Black hair culture. So Dr. Likely listened to the stories of girls she was working with, engaged in deeper conversations around their wonderings, and conceptualized an approach to engaging in science inquiry that looked to push on the girls' notions of hair being a legitimate science topic. The most amazing and fulfilling aspect of this work was listening to the girls' conversations about what counts as science. So prior to the unit, they described science as boring and only taking place in the confines of the four walls at their school. So while contributing to this dream space, the girls recognized this via scientific decisions that their mothers and their grandmothers have historically made as they choose specific hair care products based upon their experiential knowledge of hair texture and types. So centering the girls and the science inquiries that will provide them with spaces to dream, we then also are connecting this work with the science practices of obtaining and communicating information, developing and using models for examining different hair care textures, and using evidence to develop arguments around which products were best suited for particular textures. So in closing out and just thinking about this idea, I asked, how are you conceptualizing, right, the idea of Black excellence in the learning sciences? What kinds of spaces are you conceptualizing when thinking about your Raekwons, your sneakerheads, your hip hop connoisseurs, or your experts in Black hair and skincare? Green Spaces is about making concerted efforts to attending to the histories of young people while also acknowledging and valuing their insights into future possibilities, or what my colleague, Dr. Clark just mentioned as Black futures. So dream spacing is considered as a collective activity that includes continued negotiation, design, and innovation for ways of respecting and negotiating a variety of our dreams and imaginings. I argue that when we situate dream chasing and acts of imagining possible futures as exemplars of Black excellence, we also make opportunities for cultivating our own dream spaces for the kids that we are working with. So with that said, I do thank you, and I welcome any questions that you might have, please.